that really quickly. So, hi there. How's everything? Good morning, Mrs. Hogenson.
Hi, how are you, John?
Fine, fine. And we hope that you had a happy beginning of this new Gregorian 2021.
Like all of us, it was very quiet. I'm sure you and Amira had a nice
This new
New Year's Eve
Gregorian
lunch.
2021. I just
Like
echoed.
all of us, it was very quiet. Right.
So yes, it's live. We are streaming live. All right, Jeremiah. So if it says it's not live, I promise you it's streaming live. Okay, so I lost my footing because I heard echo.
Hello, Eileen and Danny, Thelma, Regina.
Good morning, Kathy.
Hey, dear. Hi, Gilbert. Good morning.
It still says connecting audio.
Yeah.
Hi, Danny.
Good morning. How are you?
Good morning.
Just out on my morning walk. Thought I'd check in.
Good. Been missing you, Danny.
Oh, I'm missing you too.
So today's topic, beautiful topic, Abdu'l-Baha in Paris. What made you decide to talk about this today before we get started?
I'm working on a biography of Horace Holly, who was living in Paris in 1913. And what I realized in researching that period of his life was that this is a part of Abdu'l-Baha's journeys to the West that's not as well known as his 1911 journey when Paris Talks came out of that. So this is quite different from the other segments of his Western journeys and worth a very close study.
Interesting, yes. And this is a reason that everyone who's joining us today should definitely share this with other people who are not present yet or now. And again, this is going to be something that you haven't really heard much about before. And I do want to get to the topic and our beautiful introduction of our beautiful speaker, Miss Catherine Hogenson. So we're going to do that now. So today's topic, you heard a little bit about it. While the time Abdu'l-Baha traveled throughout the West is well known through Paris Talks, his almost 5 months there in Paris in the winter and spring of 1913 is less appreciated. This period was different in character from the rest of his travels in the West. And I want to ask you right after I introduce you, Ms. Hodgkinson, but I found out that Abdu'l-Baha visited Germany. Had no clue about that.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk about that briefly.
Yeah, it's interesting. All right. So our beautiful introduction. Catherine Judith Hodgkinson is the author of Lighting the Western Sky, the Hearst Pilgrimage, and the Establishment of the Baha'i Faith in the West. Picking up where she left off with that first book, she is now writing a biography of the Hand of the Cause of God, Horace Holly, who was in Paris in 1913. Hodgkinson is a lawyer, historian, mother, and grandmother who resides in Tarpon Springs, Florida, with her husband, Gary Hodgkinson. She and her family served 18 years at the Baha'i World Center, and she served at the Baha'i National Center for 11 years. So I think that's about combining the two. That is, doing my math right, 31 years of service. That's amazing. That's amazing. All right. Well, Mrs. Hodgkinson, please, if you don't mind, we are ready to go.
Thank you so much, John. Abdu'l-Baha is an endlessly fascinating topic. And it's amazing to me that there are still lots of holes in what we know about him for many good reasons. And one of the things I want to say at the outset is, where do we get the information for the 1913 visit to Paris? which was the longest period of time he stayed anywhere while he was in the West. And the short answer is it came from his translator, Ahmad Soran, who is, he's here, the second from the right in this group. He's in his 20s. He has spent a lot of time in the United States and has become quite proficient in English. But he was always somebody that the master sort of had to keep an eye on. And so he was actually sent from the United States by Abdu'l-Baha back to Egypt. He did not go with Abdu'l-Baha to England. But when Abdu'l-Baha got to Paris, even though the Hippolyte Dreyfuses both spoke some Persian and were able to do some level of translation, he realized he needed someone there all the time who could translate for him into English. So he summoned Sohrab to join him in Paris. And Sohrab, who was always good at the art of self-promotion and would later break the covenant, had a Baha'i friend in the United States, Harriet McGee, and he started writing to her every single day with a blow-by-blow of what did Abdu'l-Baha do and say that day. These letters are held by the U.S. Baha'i National Archives, and the first and only book that has extensively used them is called Abdu'l-Baha in France, 1911 to 1913, by Jan Jessen, who lives in the Paris area, metropolitan area, who is a historian and librarian archivist. So he went through those letters and summarized them in this book, which you can get through Kalamat Press. I have also myself gotten some of the letters from Harriet McGee's collection, and because our dear friend Jan didn't put everything in his book, so I have a few things that are not published that we can talk about today, a few stories. But because this is from Sohrab, and because no one authenticated the sayings of Abdu'l-Baha during that visit, we can't treat it in the same way as we do Paris Talks. Paris Talks was much more thoroughly vetted, and it was the result of other several individuals taking notes during the 1911 visit. So I just want to give that brief caveat. This is why the books, Sohrab's diaries and so forth, which the friends love, but the institutions are always hesitant about, why we have to be a little careful. So 1913, the winter of 1913, Abdu'l-Baha at this point had left home in December of 1910, excuse me, in August of 1910. He had traveled first to Egypt, where he needed to get his health restored enough so that he could begin traveling. He, in the late summer of 1911, finally is able to leave Egypt, goes first to Marseille, France, and then on to Thinon-de-Banz. Well, why did he not go straight to Paris when he got to France in 1911? And the simple fact of the matter is that all of the many years that Abdu'l-Baha was a prisoner and an exile, his health had suffered considerably. Thinon-de-Banz was where there were hot thermal springs where he could get some relief from his rheumatism. So he went there. It was also late August, and anyone who knows the French, and particularly the Parisians, knows that nobody hangs out in Paris in August. They're all at resorts. And so many of the Parisian Baha'is he wanted to see were actually there in the vicinity of Thinon and Geneva. And so he was able to begin his visit with the Western friends there. He then went on to London and then back to Paris, and then on to Paris in 1911. And by the time it started getting cold, late November, early December, he was back on his way to sunny, warm Egypt, because he really suffered when he was in cold, damp climates. He spends that winter of 1911, 1912 in Egypt, and then in the spring gets on a ship, makes a brief stop in Italy, and then heads on to New York. And then we know he has this wonderful 10 months and some days in the United States, leaving the United States in early December, heading straight to England, not back to Egypt. And he arrives there in Liverpool on the 13th of December, spends 3 weeks in London, including the Christmas period. So he got to experience a British Christmas. And then he goes to make some side trips during this, goes up in early January to Scotland, back to London. And then on the 21st of January, he left England for the last time and headed to Paris, arriving at the Saint Lazare train station late at night on a very cold, wet evening. But there were about 50 people waiting for him when he arrived that evening, including the Dreyfus Barneys and Horace Howley's wife, Bertha, there at the station, so anxious to see him. I want to take a little bit of a side trip back in history to tell you how the Paris Baha'i community came to be. In 1898, Phoebe Hearst, who loved Paris and kept an apartment near where the Museum d'Orsay is today, in that area, she was letting friends of hers from New York, Mary Bowles and her daughter, Mary, who went by May, and her son, Randolph, May's brother, allowed them to stay in the apartment as sort of caretakers when Mrs. Hearst wasn't there. And Randolph Bowles, Randy Bowles, was going to the architecture school at École des Beaux-Arts. But May was, even though she was 29 years old in 1898, she was in extremely bad health and no doctor had been able to figure out what was going on. She was in fact an invalid. And when the party that was headed to the first Western pilgrimage arrived from California that fall of 1898, one of the first things that happened was Mrs. Hearst sent first Dr. Edward Gessinger in to see May, and then he sent his wife, Lua Gessinger, in to see her. And she immediately accepted the Baha'i faith as soon as Lua informed her of the coming of Baha'u'llah. She ended up going on the pilgrimage as part of the group of about 14 that Mrs. Hearst sponsored. And this is after they came back. So this is the Paris Baha'i community in 1899. With, you see, May is down here in the bottom left-hand corner, May Bowles, Maxwell, she would later become. And she is the mother of the Paris Baha'i community. She had been busy while some of the group had preceded her to Haifa and had taught this young lady, who's another American. She's an artist. This is Brunetta Herman. She was one of the first people to be taught by May in 1899. And then we have the returning pilgrims, Louis Gessinger, Edward Gessinger, Ann Apperson, and Julia Pearson. Well, May was an amazing teacher who just bubbled out with the faith. And so it took her no time to continue to expand the size of the Baha'i community. So two of the people that she taught who were friends of her brothers from the architecture program were Charles Mason Remy, who's up here at the top, and Herbert Hopper, who's also an American architectural student. She also taught her cousin from New York City, Helen Ellis Cole, who was the widow of a very wealthy lawyer from New York. And then here's Imogene Hoag, who had learned of the faith through Phoebe Hearst from California. And this is another American, Marie Squires, who will marry Herbert Hopper. And their children, descendants, would be the pillars of Central America as pioneers to that area. And then we have a Mrs. Connors that we don't know very much about. So you see very quickly, May got things moving. Between 1899 and 1902, this is a list of the believers who either became Baha'is in Paris or were confirmed in Paris. And I should say that the New York City sort of considered to be Paris to be a suburb. The New York Times would run articles about what was happening in the social seasons in Paris with the Americans there, because there was a very large American expatriate community, most of whom were well-off people who kept homes in both the United States and in Paris. And so it was also a city through which, if you were traveling to other parts of Europe, you often would come to Europe by way of Cherbourg, the port at Cherbourg, and then from Paris go on to other places. So it was a main hub for Americans in Europe, and a place that has drawn Americans for several hundred years. So you look at this list: Three Hands of the Cause, a disciple of Abdu'l-Baha, people like Thomas Breakwell, Laura Clifford Barney, to whom we owe some answered questions, Marion Jack, who Abdu'l-Baha called General Jack, who opened Bulgaria and several other places, Juliet Thompson, who you're probably familiar with, Helen Ellis Cole, she gave us Fellowship House at Greenacre, Herbert Marie Squires Hopper, who were Marie was, after Herbert's early death, was a very important Baha'i in the United States. Edith Mackay de Bonds, who would become the person who would take the faith to Switzerland. Edith Sanderson, who we will talk about more. Sidney Sprague, who traveled all over the world with as a travel teacher. And then Edith Tewksbury Jackson, who I also want to talk about. She's the one who gave us Abdu'l-Baha's home. So Edith is this lady here. She's a widow from Boston. Her sister was married to the owner of Filene's department store in Boston, so she came from a fairly prominent family, and had married a wealthy Parisian who was no children but had passed away. Charles Mason Remy says she wasn't very bright, so some of the younger members of the community sort of took advantage of her big heart. But her big spacious home in Paris was for many years the center of Baha'i activities, because in a city where apartments are very small, flats very small, her home had the space for large gatherings. And this is her on a pilgrimage in 1900. The little boy, by the way, is Shoghi Effendi. This photograph was taken at her home, and you can see by 1902 just how quickly that community has grown. We see, of course, Thomas Breakwell down here. The young boy that was in the previous picture has gone through puberty in the interim, and here he is. This is Edith Sanderson, who is very important. She came from a very wealthy Baha'i family in California. Her father was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of California. And she and her family were living in Paris because her sister was a prominent opera singer. And their home was one of three homes that, when Abdu'l-Baha was there in 1913, was a regular location for Baha'i meetings. You have Hippolyte Dreyfus here, Herbert Hopper again, Edith Mackay, Charles Mason Remy, Sidney Sprague, and of course May Bowles, who was not yet May Maxwell. Many of you are perhaps even familiar with this street. This is, I think it's this building here, and I may be wrong about this because I don't have the exact, I think it's on the third floor of this building that Abdu'l-Baha stayed when he was in Paris in 1911. This building is now owned by the French Baha'i community and is used as a holy place by them, so that you can arrange to visit it. But unfortunately, by 1913, Abdu'l-Baha was the victim of his own hospitality, because one of the Persians who visited him at that apartment liked it so much that when Abdu'l-Baha came in 1913, it was not available because that Persian had rented it. So other arrangements had to be made. But this was a brand new apartment building at the time Abdu'l-Baha was there in 1911. It had the latest modern conveniences. In fact, the street still had buildings under construction, so it was probably a bit of a mess coming and going from it. When he arrives in 1913, as I said, Hippolyte Dreyfus Barney and Laura Clifford Dreyfus Barney, who had in the interim years they had gotten married in 1911 and were Baha'i scholars. Hippolyte is a lawyer from a Jewish background, and Laura Clifford Barney comes from a well-to-do American background, but is a noted sculptor and comes from a family of creative people. They served as Abdu'l-Baha's host throughout his time in France, both in 1911 and in 1913. And this is the building where they lived. This is where the Friday night regular meetings of the Paris Baha'i community were held. When Abdu'l-Baha arrived that 21st of January, he went straight to this building, which is now a boutique hotel. By the way, all these photographs were taken by Gary and I when we were there a few years ago on the trail of Abdu'l-Baha with their friend Jan Jason, who did the book, serving as our guide. So this delightful, charming building was where an apartment was rented for Abdu'l-Baha, where he stayed for the first several months he was in Paris. And again, the Dreyfus Barneys served as his primary host during all that period. The other location where Baha'i meetings were held, and these were on Monday nights, was at the home of Edwin Scott. He is another Baha'i from the United States, who was a professional landscape painter. He had been there to study under the Impressionists. And so most of his paintings are from that style. And they're, like I said, they tend to be landscapes. But he had become a very devoted believer. He and his American wife both, and they had been to Haifa and had already met Abdu'l-Baha. And he was very much loved by the master. Their home was the other center for the Baha'is, in addition to the Sanderson and Dreyfus Barney homes. Here's an example of one of his landscapes. Occasionally they come on the market. I've talked to someone who was trying to send a small collection of them to the House of Justice. Very important person for the history of the French community. Now, just around the corner from Edwin Scott's home and studio, and again, I should bring up, remember he's an artist. So just like Juliet Thompson in New York, she had a large open space for a studio, which made it a good place for Abdu'l-Baha to have meetings. So the same was true with Edwin Scott. This is why so many meetings were held at his studio. Well, just around the corner was the Ashner Art Gallery, which was run by Horace Holly, the future hand of the cause. And here he is in front of the gallery. Abdu'l-Baha apparently visited the gallery at one of his many visits to the area where the Scott home was located. And for a brief period, the Hollies lived across the street from the Scotts. This is in the area of Paris. This is Boulevard Raspail, one block from where Raspail and Montparnasse join. So it's the center of the art world for the city of Paris. The American poets and writers and artists all hang out at cafes that are at that intersection, one block from where this gallery is located. And it's a cheaper area of Paris, so a lot of very creative people are in this particular neighborhood. One of whom is Horace's then wife, an American, and this portrait of her is by Laura's mother, Alice Pike Barney, and it's owned by the Smithsonian. The portrait of Edwin Scott is also by Alice Pike Barney and also part of the Smithsonian collection. Bertha was trying to establish herself as a fashion designer. She was an American from Wisconsin. They had met on board ship on the way back to the United States. Horace was an aspiring poet and essayist, and as well as running that art gallery. The Paris Baha'i community at that time really, by 1913, could be divided into three groups. You had the dominant group, which were American expats. They were the main ones who were running things. You had a small handful of native French people, such as Hippolyte Dreyfus, but Dreyfus himself was a bit of an outlier because he was from a Jewish background, which made him a bit of an outlier in French society because of the strong anti-Semitism that that country had. But there were a tiny number of French believers as well. They didn't mix as much with the Americans because the Americans, even though some of them know French, they like to speak in English. The other group, and this is one of the important things to remember about this 1913 trip, the other group are Persians. Paris has always been a Mecca to Persians when they are away from Iran, but also it was a place where many Persian students chose to go to do higher studies. And so particularly on the outskirts of Paris, there are a number of Persian students, both Baha'i and non-Baha'i, who are there pursuing higher education. When Abdu'l-Baha came to Paris in 1913, he really had three primary reasons for being there. First of all, was to continue to strengthen and consolidate the Baha'i community in Paris. Because during the period that he's there in 1913, he has very few public talks, very few invitations to them, and he doesn't accept many invitations. So he's not there to meet the general public. He's there to meet the Baha'i community. The second, and this is maybe the most important reason he's in Paris, is to meet with Middle Easterners. As I said, Paris is a Mecca, not just for Persians, but for people from Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. So he spends a disproportionate amount of time in 1913 meeting with important people from that region, and including the brother of the Khedive of Egypt, the king of Egypt, top Ottoman officials, as well as royalty and other prominent people from Iran. And Paris is a safe place for him to do that. He cannot do that in Akka. So many people actually travel from Iran in order to see him, and from other parts of the Middle East while he's in Paris. And he's going to stay until about the 17th of June. Why does he stay that long? Well, between the 18th and 23rd of June, the Arab-Syrian Congress is going to be held in Paris. And all kinds of big muckety-mucks from the Middle East are going to converge during late May and early June. And he wants to meet with those people. He doesn't want to be drawn into that conference, so he leaves Paris the day before the Congress starts. But this is part of why he stays for so long. He also has a personal reason for staying in Paris. Once he arrives there, he writes to his daughter, Rua, who has a throat condition, and asks her to come to Paris with her husband and a lady companion. And the Sandersons have offered their home for her to stay. So she, the day after she arrives just before Nowruz, she has a major throat operation. So Abdu'l-Baha is being the loving father tending to his daughter while he is in Paris from March all the way through to the end. She's still there when he leaves in June, although her husband has by that point returned to Egypt. But the Sandersons stop holding meetings so that they can take care of her. I want to also comment on this photograph of Abdu'l-Baha. This is an actual color photograph of Abdu'l-Baha, the only one that we're aware of. As you know, many of the early inventors and innovators of photography were based out of Paris. And he had a true color photograph made while he was there. By accident, a Baha'i happened to be going through some old color plates with another person and ran across this. So we should be very grateful that we had this. Now, I want to talk about the message that Abdu'l-Baha gave in 1913. As we know, when he was in the United States, he had one primary theme, and that was the oneness of mankind. Because in the United States, the biggest problem was racial prejudice. And so he addressed that over and over again, particularly during his time in Washington, D.C. He also talked about world unity and peace, and that was a theme in both New York and in California. But throughout all of his talks in the United States, the biggest theme was the oneness of mankind. He had a theme in Paris, particularly in 1913, and that was materialism. By the time he comes back to Paris, he has experienced what it's like to be among the peoples of England and the United States and Canada. And he has found in those populations much greater spiritual receptivity than he found among the French. And so he really comes armed to not so much address the people of France while he's there the second visit, but to help the Baha'is understand how to deal with atheism. Because atheism is the problem of France in 1913, as it still is, and the rampant materialism. So I want to read, and again, warning you that these are notes from Ahmed Sorab, so you can't take this as though I'm reading Baha'i scripture, but here is what he said on the 29th of January. Abdu'l-Baha said to Sorab, "Paris is very cold. Can you do something to make it warmer? I was happy in London while I was not feeling well. Here my health is very good, but I am very unhappy because I observe that people are thinking of everything else except God. Paris is like unto a beehive. These people are the bees. They are busy honey making, but their honey consists of pleasure and gratification of desires. We have come to Paris, but we find Paris very cold. I was anticipating that in this trip, I shall behold in this city the luminous torch of the love of God. Now, having arrived, I find that the inhabitants of this city are steeped deeper in the darkness of materialism. Every mention is on their lips except the mention of God. They entertain every thought except the thoughts of the kingdom of God. Every call is being heard in Paris except the call of the world of light. As I ponder over this condition of the Parisians, I found that like unto the worms, they are crawling in the dark strata of the earth. Day unto day, they are going deeper and deeper, never desiring to extricate themselves from the gloom of these narrow labyrinths of the earth. Therefore, it is my hope that you who are living here may show an effort and make a movement that perchance the inhabitants of Paris may obtain a new tongue, may receive a new exaltation, may take a goodly portion and a share from the heavenly illumination." He, in another place, talks about how do you wake somebody up when they're sleeping. And he says that you first, if the person's a light sleeper, just a single touch will wake them up. But if they're sleeping more, you have to shake them. And if that doesn't work, you might have to hit them with a big stick. But if that doesn't work, you will need the noise of the cannon. And of course, Abdu'l-Baha has already intimated that that's exactly what's about to wake up the people of France, the noise of a cannon. He talks about this many times. If you take Jan Jason's book and go through all of the talks from 1913, you will see that this theme of God and proof of the existence of God, how to confront materialism, the government's push toward atheism is a common theme. And one of the things that I had not realized until I was doing the research on this was how deep-seated this turning away from God had become in France, going back to the time of the French Revolution. The French Revolution so tried to eliminate Catholicism and religion that they murdered many thousands of the French clergy. They took over the churches and desecrated them. They began to hold pagan rituals in the main squares of Paris. But one of the worst things they did was the French revolutionaries sent the French army, including Napoleon, to Italy, where they captured the Pope, ransacked the Vatican, and brought the Pope as a prisoner back to France, where he died. So the eradication of religion was deep-seated. And when you also study the bloody history of the Reformation in France and the wars fought over religious doctrine and the many hundreds of thousands of people who died, the French had had enough of religion and were no longer interested in it. And at the same time had, according to Abdu'l-Baha, created one of the world's foremost cities of technology and civilization. He marveled at Paris and the innovations, the subway system, the electrification of the city, the beauty of the Haussmann buildings all over the city after they did urban renewal under Napoleon III. So he talks about how it's a vaunted civilization of Paris, but totally steeped in materialism. So this is a theme throughout his time there. However, he is not totally glum about it. He says that, speaking in May during his visit, that the present indifference shall be replaced by a great enthusiasm. The call of Abha shall be raised from every house, and the banner of Yah Baha'u'llah shall become unfurled from the top of every home. Rest ye assured of this. So he is trying to fortify the Baha'is and the few seekers that he encounters while he's in Paris. He very quickly settles into a routine. In the mornings, he would first meet with his entourage and give them delightful stories of the history of the faith. Then visitors would start coming, usually about 10 in the morning, and they would be there until noon. Some of them would get private audiences with him, and others would just sit there and listen to comments that he might make. Usually around the middle of the day, he would then make some sort of a talk, following which the guests would leave. He would sometimes have a luncheon. Then he would go out in the afternoons. One of his favorite things to do in the afternoon was to go to the parks in Paris, where sometimes he would just ride through them. As the weather became better in the spring, he would sometimes stroll through them. And it's interesting, apparently sometimes as he strolled through the parks, he would chant the writings or sing Persian songs as he went up and down the sidewalks. One time when he was in the parks, he talked about the what people should be doing there. He was in the Bois de Boulogne, and he noticed, this is springtime in Paris, which after their very cold, damp winters is glorious. And he noticed all the people just sort of sitting around, walking, strolling, riding in carriages, lying on the ground or saying grass or sailing on the lake. And here's what he said about visiting parks. How glorious it would be if these people, instead of whiling away their time here with no result, would have gathered together in groups, reading the hidden words, singing the praises of God, chanting the communes and prayers. Then this park would have transformed into a paradise of spirituality and holiness. But now it breeds the qualities which are not praiseworthy of the world of humanity. So even our leisure time, according to Abdu'l-Baha, should be well spent. Sometimes in the afternoons, he went shopping. For what? Well, I mean, this is one of his last stops before he's headed back to the Holy Land, to Egypt and then the Holy Land. And he still needs to buy gifts for the people he wants to bestow something on when he returns. And it seems that his two favorite gifts were walking canes and umbrellas. So he often would pick out some more walking canes and umbrellas. And then one day he stopped at a hardware store and bought some hammers that he wanted to take back to Haifa, and other implements, tools he wanted to take back. So he did that. And a few times he actually went out by himself without even a translator, just to wander around Paris. And we can only imagine what happened during those periods. During the evenings, he often had dinner invitations, and sometimes he would attend the evening gatherings of the Persian and Baha'i friends. In the beginning, his health was okay and he was able to do it. But by February, as the winter drew on and his weariness continued unabated, he got sick and he had to start curtailing a lot of his activities. He stopped accepting many invitations. He still allowed many days for people to come and visit him, but he wasn't so able to do as many meetings. At the beginning of April, here he is with a group. At the beginning of April, he decided to surprise some people. He went off to first Germany and then Budapest, Hungary, and Vienna. His first stop in Germany was Stuttgart, which is where two American sisters, Fanny and Alma Knobloch, these are the sisters of Joseph Hanna and his wife, who had taught the faith to Louis Gregory. They were of German origin, and so they went pioneering to Stuttgart and had already begun to raise up a Baha'i community there. So Abdu'l-Baha decided to go to Germany at the beginning of April, and he surprised them. He just showed up at the hotel, and then he got on the phone and let them know, so guess who's here? So the friends, of course, were thrilled. They very quickly put something together, and he met with a large group of children that they arranged and had some other big meetings. One of the people that he met while he was in Germany was Council Swartz, who would be named one of his disciples by Shoghi Effendi and would be very important to the growth of the community in Germany, he and his wife. One interesting side note is that as they were traveling by train to Stuttgart from Paris, Abdu'l-Baha instructed his entourage, all Persians, to take off their Persian clothes and put on Western clothes, including their headgear. He did not want them walking around Germany in Persian attire. And of course, this is not too far in time from the beginning of World War I, and then shortly after World War I, the prejudices really come out full time in Germany, and we had the rise of the Nazis. So it's understand why he might do that. When he gets back to Paris, rather than going to the cozy little charming apartment, he stays at the Hotel Baltimore, which he didn't much care for. They weren't particularly excited, the management of the Hotel Baltimore, by the types of people who came to see Abdu'l-Baha. So he packed his own bags. He insisted on doing that, went around the corner and went back to this pension where he had stayed the first few days he was back in Paris. He loved this little charming pension just around the corner from the Hotel Baltimore. And so this is where he stayed to the end of his visit. In May, the number of people from the Middle East is starting to grow that are coming to Paris that he wants to see. And it's very interesting that Ahmad Sohrab in some of his letters doesn't even say who these people are that he's meeting with, because they're such prominent people, and it would be so perhaps disadvantageous for it to get out that Abdu'l-Baha had even met with them, that he doesn't even write down any indication of who some of these people are. So we know that they're very important, prominent people. He's very happy to name the ones that he's allowed to name, but Abdu'l-Baha clearly had him on a leash and would not let him name everyone that he was meeting. One day in the morning, Abdu'l-Baha went to Sohrab and asked him to write out in French or English the names and addresses of certain locations around Paris where important Middle Easterners were staying on little cards. And then Abdu'l-Baha took off, and he took those cards, he would hand them to a taxi driver and say, "Take me to this location." And so all day he went to see important Middle Easterners. We have no idea who he met with or what he had to say. We do know that he was the officials at the Persian embassy were very warm to him, and that many important people also sought him out and invited him to dinner. In fact, he spent Nowruz at the Persian embassy at their celebration of Nowruz and took his entourage. So this is a story of the 1913 visit that's extremely important. As Jan said, he was actually doing shuttle diplomacy at the time. But it will take friends who are fluent in Persian and Arabic and additional archival material that we do not yet have access to know exactly what he's doing during this period. In the late spring, Horace Holly, who, as I said, is trying to make it as a professional writer, is working on an introductory book to the faith in English. And so one of the things he's doing is reading excerpts of it to the Baha'i meetings, including to meetings where Abdu'l-Baha is present. And his little daughter, who's 2 years old, is running around. Abdu'l-Baha, by the way, loved Hertha. One day when he picked her up, and because she came to him, he then started talking about his own little boy, Hussein, who died when he was about 5 years old, and how Hertha reminded him of his little son. One morning, Abdu'l-Baha and Laura Barney were sort of playing with Hertha. Abdu'l-Baha would put some candy in his hand, and little Hertha would come up and take that candy and then go across the room and hand it to Laura. And then she'd come back to Abdu'l-Baha, get another piece of candy and take it back to Laura. And he found this, of course, very, very amusing. But Horace and his wife, Bertha, they were career people. They were both of them ambitious. She's trying to get her career as a fashion designer going. He's trying to make it as a writer, poet, and art gallery owner. And so Hertha is, most of the time, is with nannies. One day, Horace is busy telling the gathering about his book, and all of a sudden, Abdu'l-Baha stops him and says, "This child is your book. This child is your book." Trying to subtly remind him that he had even greater responsibilities, not as a writer, but as a parent. There are very many wonderful little anecdotes of things that Abdu'l-Baha said while he was with the Friends. He years later, Horace Holly was asked by Hand of the Cause of God, Dorothy Baker, if she would recount his memories of the time he spent with Abdu'l-Baha in Paris, because he visited him a number of times in the morning, as well as attending the gatherings that Abdu'l-Baha would speak at. And it's interesting that it was too personal for Horace Holly to write about the Paris time with Abdu'l-Baha. He had written about his first meeting at Pinon de Bons, but he didn't really feel comfortable talking about the Paris period. And the only thing he brought up was, he said one day, and I've been able to sort of figure out when approximately this was. I think it was May, and probably at the Martha Pension. Abdu'l-Baha was standing at a window, and someone asked him to explain eternity. And he said simply, "When you're at the sun, there is no day or night, and that is eternity." So that's all that Horace felt comfortable in recounting. One of the things that Abdu'l-Baha apparently said while he was meeting with the Friends in these morning sessions was this. And apparently, as he said it, he became very animated and had his hands waving in the air as though he was dancing. And he said, flame forth, be a torch, be not silent, shine, shine. Unless each of one of you becomes a burning torch, the cause will not spread, the teachings will not be promulgated, the influence of the words will not be felt, the souls will not be attracted, the hearts will not be moved. Unless you get wings, you cannot fly, you cannot soar heavenward. Hold the torches of the love of God in your hands. Let your wings grow. I expect these things from you, and I beg and entreat that in Paris you may become the brilliant lamps of the divine guidance. As June came along, and he had returned at the end of April from his trips to the German-speaking areas and settled in for the last 6 or 8 weeks of Paris, he began to hold some farewell gatherings. And the last time he was at the Scots, a week or so before he would actually leave Paris, and this was really his last large gathering with the Baha'i community, he had this to say. The days of my departure are nigh, so I wish to say farewell to you. In Paris, I have stayed more than in any other city. In whatever city I proclaimed the kingdom of Abha, in a few days the cry of the kingdom rose on high, the fire of the love of God flared forth, and the light of the Sun of Truth shone bright. The country was quickened and stirred, and the command of God given in all the assemblies. I arrived in Paris. It was my great hope that here the flame of the cause of God should rise higher and the brilliance of the light of reality be greater. The signs of the kingdom of God should become widely known, and the spreading of the breezes of God be speeded. This was the wisdom of my long stay in Paris. It is my hope that after me such confirmation and enthusiasm may obtain that the pillars of Paris may shake and the fire of the love of God burn with great brilliance. The other subject of which it is necessary for me to speak to you is this, that at every particular time a certain power moves the people. But the power that is moving the world today is the power of the covenant. If you wish to bring motion and ecstasy to Paris, if you wish to see it illumined and rest under the effulgence of the light of the kingdom, then call it to the covenant. Be firm and enthusiastic in the covenant. And then you will behold that Paris would become another Paris. It would be quickened with another soul. It would have another life. The fire of the love of God within it would have another flame, and the people would fall into a different commotion and a different ecstasy. Abdu'l-Baha did not leave with all of his entourage. He sent some of his entourage back to Germany. And then he packed up. It took an omnibus to get all the luggage to the train station the morning he was to leave. He took the first train with Ahmad Sohrab and left the rest of his entourage who were still in Paris to finish everything and to take a later train. They got to Marseille late that evening. Normally, a train ride today would take about 3 hours. Then it took about 10 hours to get to Marseille. The next morning, as they're at the docks about to leave, two Baha'i youth, a young man who's we know only by his first name is Albert, and a young lady by the name of Marguerite, are the only two Baha'is there to see off the little party of Abdu'l-Baha and his entourage. They're there at the docks. They had been sent by two of the believers in Paris. And Marguerite spoke for the both of them, saying that the last loving thought sent to you from France is ours. And these two small French Baha'is are bringing to you the loving greeting of all the people of France. So these two youth were the ones on behalf of that country to bid him farewell. And Marguerite said that it was a good sign that it was youth who were doing that. So they got on board the Himalaya, the ship that would take them to Egypt. And the first thing Abdu'l-Baha did was instruct his companions that the ship was full of people headed to India, to British India. They would travel through the Suez and go to India. It was an ideal opportunity to teach and to spread the faith to India by getting to know the people they would be sharing on board the ship. Also on board the Himalaya was the brother of the king of Egypt, who he had already visited with several times in Paris. And so finally, he arrives back in Egypt on the 17th of June to the loving arms of his family and the exhilarated, anxious believers there in that community. He would not return to Haifa until December, after a few months' rest in Egypt. So I know that I've covered a lot of ground. There's much, much more to talk about than I could possibly do in this limited time, but there may be some questions or comments. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to John, so he can let me know what has shown up on the chat.
Hi there. There is currently in the Zoom chat no questions. However, if you could please, all of you who are with us today, if you have any questions, feel free to type it into the Zoom chat. You can do that in the chat button and you type your message. And further, those on Facebook and those of you on YouTube, likewise, type in your questions into the comment section, and we'd love to get to those questions you have. Now, there actually is one question, and it's about the spirit of France and Paris when he went there, when Abdu'l-Baha visited.
Mm-hmm.
So what did Abdu'l-Baha suggest to the French believers to be the solution to coming and bringing that spirituality where there is none?
He tried to give them ammunition. For example, he talked about proof of the existence of God. Many of us are familiar with the letter he wrote to Auguste Forel, who was a psychiatrist and philosopher working out of Geneva, near the French border, inside of Thonon de Bonn. But many of his talks, he brings this up. He talks about, he tries to give them the what it means to believe in Baha'u'llah, belief in God, and what materialism does. He gives stories of Baha'u'llah and what it means, the divinity of the manifestations of God. So a lot of his are very deep spiritual themes, trying to give them the ammunition so as they go about their lives and are encountering the people of Paris, they will have some way to talk to them about. He talks about kindness and compassion, the importance of service, how effective the Holy Spirit can be. He talks about the physical side of the world versus the spiritual side of the world in a talk to the Theosophists. He talks about some specific things that we see and other things such as a common language, equality of men and women, things like this. But he talks about asceticism and monkish behavior and how that's not appropriate. He talks about, I'm going actually sort of down a list, what it means to be an agnostic. He talks about the true teachings of Christ versus what the Pope and the priest are doing. So you see, he's educating the Baha'is. He gets a few invitations to the usual suspects, the spiritualists, the Theosophists. He does talk to one seminary and so forth, but he is fortifying the Baha'is to understand what sea it is they're swimming in. And they are swimming in a sea of materialism, a sea where agnostics and atheists are the predominant groups. And so he is helping them to understand this, to fortify their own faith so that they will be steadfast, and to give them the ammunition to know how to talk to people who do not believe in God by giving them proofs, material versus spiritual. I'm just going, he work in prayer, the authenticity of the Bible, the importance of the covenant, spiritual versus material education, the tension between the government and the church, anti-religious sentiments in the government, prejudice and dogma to be found in religions. He's educating the Baha'is so that they will know how to not get caught up in these ideas that are swimming all around them. So it would be hard without getting into these long talks of his. Some of the same themes, of course, are in Paris talks, but he goes over and over these same themes in the second visit, the longer visit. I hope that's sufficient. Other questions?
Yes, it is. Thank you. Thank you so much. The question that came from Alex Boyson is this question.
Mm-hmm.
Any parallel to that pilgrimage in history and encounter from foreigners with a prophet, even the Bab, or with one of the Imams? Was there any parallel in what Abdu'l-Baha had done in this context?
Well, I don't know enough about the history of the Imams to know. But certainly, I think that if you looked at the early Christians, the Book of Acts, and the teaching work of the early Christian teachers, especially in Rome, and major centers of the Greco-Roman world, you would see many parallels. There, of course, they're not going against atheism and materialism, except perhaps in the city of Rome, but they're going against paganism. And paganism, when religion dies, paganism starts rearing its head. And you can see, if you travel through Europe these days, you can see the resurgence of paganism. I mean, look at all the people who show up at Stonehenge on the solstices. This is one of the things. But I think that's would be probably the closest parallel I can think of.
Thank you so much. And there's a question from Danny Guaro. He's asking, is there a book you could recommend for going deeper on these talks?
Well, if I stop screen sharing here. Okay. There's this book. This is Abdu'l-Baha in France. This is by Janjaison. And the only way it's done under the National Spiritual Assembly of France, so it's been reviewed and accepted. It is available through Kalamat Press in the United States. Now, I know the Kalamat Press does not sell through the U.S. distribution service, but you can go directly to their website and get it from them. And it also has the 1911 visit, and it has additional notes of what became Paris talk. So, for example, if Abdu'l-Baha, if 3 people took notes on one morning, and one of those notes, sets of notes, ended up in Paris talk, you could see the other notes in this book and compare them. So anyway, it's quite a tome. There are Jan continues to do study of the history of Abdu'l-Baha in Paris, as are at least 2 other of the French Baha'is are doing research into this. But I don't know whether their books will come out in English, at least initially.
That's intriguing. So there is a way to get more in the book that you saw. If you, Jale Sian is asking if you could show the book again, because she said the cover is not visible.
So can you see this?
I actually can't read it.
It's hard to read unless let me see.
Abdu'l-Baha in France, 1911 and 1913.
Right.
That's the name of the book. Right. Abdu'l-Baha in France, 1911 and 1913. Okay, she says thank you. All right. Well, Danny, that was a great question. Thank you for asking that question. So, and he says thank you back. All right. There is one other question here. What happened? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I see it. Yeah.
All right. Okay. What happened to Edwin Scott and his wife? Did they stay in France, or did they move to England, or where did they go?
They stayed in France. As far as I know, they stayed all the way. They were there during World War I. Of course, the thing with Paris was that even though it looked like the Germans were going to close in on Paris, and they actually shelled the outskirts of Paris in September of 1914, they never took Paris. So Paris had a almost normal, to the degree being in the middle of a war can be normal, period. Horace and his family, by the way, escaped Paris as the Germans were closing in, and ended up going back to the United States because they were concerned about the safety of their daughter. But the Scotts remained. Edwin Scott is someone we're just starting to learn more about. There's a couple of people doing research on him. He was certainly a B-level painter. He, I think, studied under Whistler, and you can find him on the internet. The Smithsonian owns some of his paintings, as do other art galleries and museums. But he is certainly not a prominent painter, but most of his are French landscapes. He got some awards, and also awards for just promoting the arts. and stayed a steadfast Baha'i and one of the pillars of the French Baha'i community to the end of his years. So he's worth knowing about. I wish I knew more. I know that there are people researching him, and I know he and Horace Holly were neighbors for at least about 6 months. And then the art gallery of Horace's was just around the block. Any other questions?
Yes, there is. So this question is from Alex Boyson from Norway.
Mm-hmm.
He's asking, I think, 2 questions. So I'm going to ask them both at the same time. How was the timing of the pilgrimage historic? In other words, the historical context in society and in Baha'i faith's history. And second, what role did Horace Holly play in the ministry of the Guardian? So Alex is maybe fast forwarding in time a little bit, as it's not in 1913 that the Guardian, his ministry is active. It's the master Abdu'l-Baha, servant of Baha, who is the person that all Baha'is turn to. The Guardian is but a child. However, he's asking that question in follow-up.
Okay, well, of course, 1913 is a pivotal time for Abdu'l-Baha to be in France, because he also knows World War I is about to start. And just about a year after he leaves Paris is when the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, and the ball started rolling that would lead to that terrible catastrophe. So it was, France was really one of the major centers of Western culture and politics. And it was important, I think, for him to be there during that period. And also, like I said, it provided him an opportunity to meet with a lot of important people. Now, Horace, his first meeting of Abdu'l-Baha happened when Abdu'l-Baha first arrived in France. Hippolyte Dreyfus Barney sent him a telegram. He and his wife were at that time living in northern Italy, and invited them to Fanon. Abdu'l-Baha asked the Dreyfus Barneys to send a number of telegrams to people like Juliet Thompson and Charles Mason Remy, asking them to join him in Europe when he first arrived there. And of course, many of them assumed they might never have another opportunity to see him. So anyway, when Horace first met Abdu'l-Baha, he had a spiritual transformation. Just seeing him across a lawn at the hotel was enough to cause a spiritual transformation in him. And of course, he later would become a hand of the cause. During the ministry of Shoghi Effendi, Horace Holly, for all of that, or most of that, was secretary of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States. And he did many things for the faith during that period, including, for example, he was the one that came up with the idea of the Baha'i World. And so he was really the first editor of the Baha'i World and wrote most of the important summaries of what was happening in the world for each of those volumes on behalf of the Guardian. He handled a lot of very delicate problems for the Guardian, and was involved with many Baha'i publications. He wrote a number of important Baha'i essays, and became essentially, as Dorothy Baker said, the pen of the American Baha'i community. So when the book comes out in 2022, you'll be able to see all the many things he did. But he was one of the people behind the scenes instrumental in the establishment of the administrative order. In fact, Shoghi Effendi offhandedly commented to someone one time that Horace and I built the administration together. So this is his primary claim to fame as the champion builder of the Baha'i administrative order. He also had a very important role to play with the Hands of the Cause during the period of the interregnum, when between the death of Shoghi Effendi in 1957 and his own death in the Holy Land in July of 1960, the major documents that the Hands of the Cause sent to the Baha'i world were drafted by Horace. And he was the one who apparently had the decisive role when the Hands were in session in 1960 about what to do about the defection of Charles Mason Reaney. And they were really apparently wavering as to whether to declare him a covenant breaker and excommunicate him. And it was Horace who sort of was the decisive voice that turned the group around on that and gave them the courage to take the firm action that was needed. I hope that answer is. I could talk for 5 hours to answer that question, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. That was amazing. And also Alex says thank you as well. He says thank you again. So
Much obliged.
did you hear Alex?
I think I did briefly. Yes.
Thank you.
And he said thank you.
Thank you.
So the next question, and it is about, again, the book that you wrote. Where can people find the book that you wrote, Lighting the Western Sky, that one?
Amazon. It's the easiest place. It's a little slightly cheaper than George Ronald or the Baha'i Distribution Service. Just go onto Amazon and it's readily available there.
Okay, cool. And what do people expect to read when they read that book?
Lighting the Western Sky is essentially the story about how the Baha'i faith got started in the West. And it's the story of how first Kerala comes to the United States, teaches Edward and Louis Getzinger. They in turn teach Phoebe Hearst, the wealthy widow and prominent lady. And through her, many other people are taught. And then she takes a group of 14 of them to meet Abdu'l-Baha. And this is really the pivotal moment where the faith becomes firm in the West because of this direct contact with the master. At that point, the master wasn't even writing to the friends in the West. But when in December 1898, Edward and Louis arrive in Akka as the first Western believers to meet Abdu'l-Baha, it changes everything. And it opens the floodgates. Many other people go on pilgrimage, and the first Western pilgrimage is talked about extensively by Shoghi Effendi, and God Passes By because of its importance.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And those listening hopefully will too. So I'm going to do a scan as I did promise those visiting on Facebook that I would do so. I don't see any questions on Facebook unless for some reason it hasn't updated on my computer. We don't have any more questions right now that I see on Zoom, unless Jeremiah got one and I did not see it from him. I think we are good to go on questions. We don't have any more questions.
Can I tell you one last story that I forgot to bring up? I had made a point of showing you Edith Jackson, and then we saw the picture taken in her apartment. Edith had no children, and she was raising as a son the young man that you saw in the picture next to Thomas Breakwell. But her husband had left her opulent apartment and a fair amount of money. And her husband had nieces and nephews who were determined to get that money in that apartment. And she had decided she wanted a place to live in Haifa. So she built the master's house. And this posed a bit of a problem because it was technically in her name, even though Abdu'l-Baha was there. And the nieces and nephews were trying to get all of her property with lawsuits in Paris. So the Dreyfus Barneys had to sort of step in, particularly with Hippolyte being an attorney, and solve that problem and provide the remaining funds needed for the master's house. But when Abdu'l-Baha came, he loved Mrs. Jackson very much. But by this point, she was an elderly lady in 1913, And her nieces, the nieces and nephews had taken over the apartment and put her in the attic area. So Abdu'l-Baha comes to visit her, and he meets with her up in that attic. And she starts crying, of course, as soon as he sees her. And he just loves her and showers all his blessings upon her. And as he leaves the building, he turns to his entourage and says, "See what greed does? Look at how this poor lady is being treated because of the greed of the family." And throughout the time that he was in Paris, both visits, he was very compassionate and constantly made sure he went to see her. And the very last thing he did was he sent roses when he was leaving. He sent roses to Mrs. Jackson and sent roses to the mother of Edith Sanderson for taking care of his daughter. So I think this kindness of Abdu'l-Baha is something that we need to remember.
Yes, he was definitely very considerate in that, and that's
Yeah.
very astounding, the circumstances. I do actually have one important question that Alex Carlberg, he always gives good questions, and I have to say this is a good question. So this will be the last question for today. He says, could you talk about the book Paris Talks? Is it accurate that the English translations are generally considered close to the original talks in Persian? That's a great question. I
don't think I can make a definitive statement about Paris Talks. It is based on notes, and I think that both with Promulgation of Universal Peace, which is the talks in the United States, and Paris Talks, there was an attempt to try to authenticate the talks some, and a tremendous, this is part of what I'm seeing in my research on Horace Holly, was the review committees were really very actively involved, also with Shoghi Effendi and the notes that were taken by Mahmoud and other people to try to make sure that they could authenticate the talks. That was not done with all of the talks that Sohrab reported, which is why when Sohrab wanted to publish the diary of his time with Abdu'l-Baha in Egypt, the institutions really sort of balked at it. Shoghi Effendi gave it to the American National Assembly to make a decision about that. And but he also said that nothing in Sohrab's books should be put in quotation marks. So we can't accept any of the thing in Sohrab's writing as this is word for word what he said. But I know that Paris Talks and Promulgation of Universal Peace were very carefully vetted. So it's probably gets the gist. The talks of Abdu'l-Baha should never be treated as scripture in the same sense as his writings. And I think that's a very important point that we should always keep in mind. In fact, they really shouldn't be used during the initial portion of the feast. They can be used during the second portion of the feast, but not the first portion.
That's really intriguing. That's really intriguing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alex, for asking that question. Alex Carlberg from Florida. I've had 3 Alexes show up at the same time. Thank you, Alex. So we are done with questions for today, and we thank you so much for joining us for this very, very exemplary talk, and the beautiful presentation and the thoroughness. If there's anything you want to close out with, we would love to hear. And hopefully those of you who are watching today will not just check out the book, but you'll share this video with people who want to learn a little more they haven't seen before.
Well, I don't really have much more to say, except that it's been a great pleasure. I've had to encapsulate a lot into a little, but I hope that you'll look at not just my books, but some of the other books that are about to come out and have come out on this period. I know this next year that there will be a number of new books coming out on Abdu'l-Baha. So I'm sure that some of the ones the French friends are working on will include this important period. But I just wish you all the best, all of you, and thank you for joining this morning.
Thank you so much, and everyone likewise for joining us. This is from the local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Clearwater. The website www.clearwaterbaha'is.org hosts all the events that are going on. We have Sunday devotions before we have these sessions at 11. We have devotions at 10. And we have other events that we will post on the Clearwater Baha'is website. Please stay tuned for more, and you can find more information about our speaker, Kathy. If you didn't see it already, it's on our website. You can find it there. Thank you, everyone, and have a very beautiful Sunday.